Bruce Lee faced a legendary Muay Thai fighter. 10 seconds later, the room went completely silent. The men who were there still described the silence first. Not the strike, not the movement, the silence that followed. Heavy, settled, unquestioned. A respected Muay Thai fighter had come to test a man he did not fully believe in. 10 seconds later, he was no longer asking anything. No one argued about what happened in that room afterward. They only spoke about how quickly certainty can change hands. The hall was unremarkable at first glance. Narrow wooden floors, a few mirrors cracked at the edges, the faint scent of liniment and sweat hanging in the air. But those who trained there knew it was more than a physical space. It was a place where skill carried its own weight, and respect was earned in quiet increments, not loud declarations. Bruce Lee moved through the room with a calm precision, adjusting a training pad, rolling his shoulders, testing the elasticity of his own limbs. He spoke little, and when he did, it was to correct a subtle stance or refine a movement. Nothing drew attention. Yet, for those watching, the control he exhibited was unmistakable. Every step measured, every shift of balance intentional. Then the name arrived, the challenger. A Muay Thai fighter of legendary repute, visiting from Thailand, known for his iron legs and calculated aggression. His reputation had preceded him. Stories of victories, of opponents who had faltered under the sheer weight of his presence, filled the minds of those in the hall. In many ways, the visitor was already feared before his body crossed the threshold. Observers noted a subtle shift the moment he entered. The fighter's posture was exacting, each muscle trained to respond, each motion designed to dominate. He moved through the hall like a shadow of certainty, the kind that can make lesser men tighten their grip on what they hold. Yet Bruce Lee did not rise to meet the aura. He remained calm, feet planted lightly, eyes meeting the challenger's once, without flinching. Attention settled into the room, not loud or forced, but undeniable. It was the quiet that comes before a storm, not the roaring kind, but the stillness in the air that tells the world something has changed, that the expected order is being questioned. People shifted on their feet, whispered in near silence, sensing that something would happen, though they could not yet imagine how. Time itself seemed to slow. Each man sized the other in increments invisible to casual eyes. The Muay Thai fighter, used to measuring strength in outward displays, found himself in an unfamiliar space. A space where confidence was mirrored without display, where presence alone could weigh heavier than action. And Bruce Lee, ever observant, measured not strength, but intent. By the time the room had fully absorbed the challenger's entrance, a subtle understanding had already formed among those watching. This encounter would not follow the patterns they knew. Skill and reputation had met, but it was quiet mastery, not brute force, that would determine the outcome. And in that knowledge, the room, already tense, began to hold its breath. No one could yet say what would happen, but everyone in that hall, in those quiet moments before movement, already sensed the inevitability. The Muay Thai fighter moved with precision as he stepped further into the hall. Each footfall was deliberate, yet deceptively light, a contrast to the reputation he carried. His gaze swept the room, taking in the mirrors, the spectators, and finally, Bruce Lee. There was no flourish, no overt gesture of challenge, only the subtle assertion that he belonged, that his skill was known and unquestioned. Bruce Lee watched. He did not rise from his stance, nor did he signal a greeting beyond a brief nod. His posture was unchanging, his focus steady, as though the very air around him absorbed the energy in the room. Observers later remarked that this calm alone unsettled the visitor. It was the first test, silent but clear, and it required no effort. The two men faced each other across a narrow span of polished floor. Between them, a quiet tension held the room in place. The onlookers noted the small gestures that spoke volumes. A subtle shift of shoulders, the narrowing of eyes, the way fingers lightly brushed against training pads. Each movement restrained, carried intent. There were no words exchanged beyond a courteous acknowledgement of presence. Bruce Lee's restraint was deliberate. He did not invite confrontation, but he did not flinch from it. The challenger, accustomed to being the one whose presence demanded deference, now found himself measured against a calm that did not bend. Observers later recalled the sense of observation in those minutes. It was as if each man was reading the other in slow increments, every movement a sentence, every pause a paragraph. The fighter's customary confidence was present, but it began to ripple with subtle uncertainty. This was not a test of endurance or brute strength. It was a negotiation of perception, and in such moments, silence can be more decisive than the loudest strike. By the time the room had adjusted to the visitor's presence, a quiet understanding had emerged. Both men had established their authority in the simplest ways possible. One through reputation, the other through measured stillness. No one moved, yet the room itself seemed to acknowledge that a different kind of confrontation was about to unfold. One where physical skill would matter, but perception, control, and timing would decide everything. And in that quiet, the hall seemed to shrink around them. Every observer held their breath, aware that what followed would be witnessed not as spectacle, but as demonstration, something irreversible and quietly inevitable. Word of the encounter traveled quietly at first, shared in whispered conversations among students and instructors who had been present. There were no announcements, no fanfare, only the subtle movement of attention. Those who heard knew something unusual had taken place. A meeting not merely of skill, but of presence, reputation, and control. By the time onlookers arrived, the atmosphere had shifted. The hall, once ordinary, felt charged with anticipation. Observers noted the small, almost imperceptible signs of tension. The way a student's hands tightened on a training pad, how a coach paused mid-step, the way eyes flicked repeatedly to the space between the two men. Even without action, the room had become a stage, and every breath seemed to count. The challenger, accustomed to public recognition, began to sense the difference here. His usual aura of certainty, cultivated through years of victories and respect, met a force unfamiliar in its quiet authority. Bruce Lee made no announcements, uttered no warnings, yet his control of the environment was absolute. Those watching later described a creeping inevitability, the sense that something decisive had already begun, that the hierarchy of perception was shifting even before the first move. Small gestures, normally unnoticed in ordinary training, gained significance. The Muay Thai fighter adjusted his stance. Bruce Lee shifted his weight fractionally. Observers saw a subtle tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, and understood that the tension in the room was now psychological as much as physical. The silent audience became a participant, sensing the invisible negotiation unfolding before them. Time stretched. Each second was magnified in importance. The space between the two men seemed to shrink, not physically, but in the weight of expectation. The room became still enough to hear the faintest movement, a shift of the floor beneath a foot, the brushing of a training pad, each sound marking an unspoken rhythm. Witnesses later described the sensation as if the air itself had thickened, pressing on everyone present, demanding quiet observation, demanding acknowledgement of skill and authority. By the time the hall reached this state of taut attention, it was clear. This was no ordinary demonstration. Every movement, no matter how small, every pause, every subtle shift in posture, carried meaning. Observers knew instinctively that the next moments would define not only who held control in the room, but how mastery itself could exert quiet dominance. And in that silence, everyone present understood something unspoken, that the outcome, however it would unfold, was inevitable. Then it happened. Not with a shout, not with a sudden motion that demanded attention, but with a subtle shift, a movement so precise that many witnesses later struggled to describe it fully. Bruce Lee did not charge. He did not swing wildly. He simply acted, and the hall, previously thick with expectation, contracted around that action. The demonstration lasted no more than 10 seconds. In that time, every principle Bruce Lee had cultivated, efficiency, timing, control, became visible in the quietest possible way. His strikes were measured, almost invisible in their intent, yet they disrupted the challenger's rhythm instantly. The Muay Thai fighter, trained to anticipate aggression, found himself reacting before he fully understood what had occurred. His balance faltered, his confidence wavered, and the room felt the shift. Observers later described a strange sensation. The moment was over before it felt like it had begun. Yet the impact was undeniable. The visitor's body moved, but his certainty did not follow. Bruce Lee remained calm, feet lightly touching the floor, eyes steady, every motion controlled and deliberate. It was mastery demonstrated not through spectacle, but through the quiet dismantling of expectation. No one in the room audibly gasped. There was no cheer. Only the tension that had held the hall tightened momentarily, then released in an almost imperceptible sigh. The challenger's presence, once commanding, had lost something in those seconds. A subtle but complete acknowledgement that control had passed. Witnesses later said the silence that followed was heavier than any sound, heavier than any shout. In the following moments, the visitor's movements became cautious, deliberate, almost hesitant. Each step was measured against the memory of that brief intervention. Bruce Lee made no comment, issued no instruction, offered no explanation. The demonstration itself carried all the authority needed. The lesson was embedded in the way the space shifted, in the way the visitor's posture subtly changed, in the quiet authority of action rather than words. By the time the audience had processed what occurred, the inevitability had settled fully. The outcome had been decided not by force of numbers, nor by reputation alone, but by the control of movement, perception, and timing. Every witness understood, without needing confirmation, that the demonstration had ended, and that mastery, in its quietest form, had been unmistakably shown. The hall remained still. For several moments, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the air itself was respecting the authority that had quietly asserted itself. It was a moment suspended in observation, a silent declaration that dominance need not roar to be absolute. The Muay Thai fighter's confidence, so carefully built over years of victories and public recognition, began to fracture, not violently, not in sudden defeat, but quietly, imperceptibly, within the space of a single glance. Witnesses later described a subtle shift in his posture. Shoulders that had been squared now slumped fractionally, eyes that had scanned with assurance flickering with uncertainty. It was not pain that defined this moment. There was no shout, no groan, no dramatic fall. The collapse was psychological, a quiet unraveling of certainty in the presence of mastery. Every movement the visitor had relied upon, instinctive counters, practiced strikes, the weight of reputation, became measured, hesitant, second-guessed. The room itself seemed to register the shift, as if the air had absorbed the subtle change and carried it across every observer. Bruce Lee remained composed. His expression never changed, his body never overextended. The quiet control that had defined his demonstration now exerted its full effect. The Muay Thai fighter was confronting not just physical skill, but the undeniable authority of perception. In those moments, dominance revealed itself without aggression. Influence was exercised through precision, observation, and restraint. Witnesses later recalled the almost imperceptible signs of surrender. A slight backward step, a careful, slowed response to a shift in stance, a hesitation before striking, as if the visitor's mind, trained to trust instinct, now doubted its own reflexes. The lesson was not in a blow struck, but in a reality established. Certainty, once shaken, can unravel swiftly when faced with mastery. The hall remained silent. No one whispered, no one moved. The Muay Thai fighter's aura of intimidation, once palpable, had softened into cautious calculation. It was a collapse unseen by casual observers, yet undeniable in its effects. Bruce Lee's mastery had not needed to confront strength directly. It had simply exposed the subtle limits of perception and timing, leaving the visitor's confidence to collapse quietly on its own terms. In the minutes that followed, every movement in the room was measured against that brief, silent unraveling. Observers later spoke of a collective, unspoken understanding. Power could be exercised without spectacle, and lessons could be delivered without sound. The moment had ended, yet its weight lingered, imprinting itself on memory and perception alike. By the time anyone dared to speak again, the air had shifted irrevocably. Authority had been asserted not through force, but through quiet mastery. And those present understood that the most profound dominance often leaves the world silent, rather than shouting its presence. Years later, the hall was quiet in a different way. The wooden floors had worn further, the mirrors more fractured, but the story of that day remained. Students, instructors, and those who had observed from the edges still recounted the incident, each in fragments, each carrying the same certainty. What had happened could not be unlearned. The Muay Thai fighter returned to Thailand, still respected, still undefeated in the record books. Yet those who trained with him noticed a subtle change. His approach to confrontation, once immediate and commanding, became measured. Confidence no longer demanded demonstration. It was tempered by the memory of an encounter where authority had been quietly, absolutely, undeniable. For Bruce Lee, the event became one of many moments in which mastery was expressed without spectacle. Yet among those who witnessed it, it achieved a kind of legend. Stories were told not of a dramatic victory, not of a brutal confrontation, but of the 10 seconds that carried the weight of years. A demonstration so precise, so restrained, that it altered perception itself. The room itself, for those present, had absorbed the lesson. Mirrors reflected not just faces, but posture and presence. Students spoke of the quiet control they had witnessed, how it could unsettle even the most formidable opponents. And in those retellings, there was no exaggeration, no embellishment, only the observation that mastery, exercised with discipline and restraint, leaves its mark far longer than any shouted claim. Even decades later, those who recount the story do so in hushed tones, aware that the essence of what occurred cannot be fully captured in words. Bruce Lee's calm authority, his capacity to assert dominance without aggression, became a standard not just of technique, but of approach. The understanding that skill is amplified by restraint, and that the most profound lessons often speak in silence. And so the legend endures. The hall may have emptied, the fighter may have left, but the story remains in the memory of those who watched, in the quiet weight of presence that cannot be challenged. Years later, one can still sense it, the inevitability, the control, the moment when authority spoke without a word, and the room went completely silent.